The Restoration in 18th century witnessed the rise of the novel, the emergence of a new genre in Europe, a prose narrative genre that is unlike the prose narratives of the past and certainly unlike the verse narratives of the past. What is a novel? It is not a generic name for any kind of literary text. It is a very specific genre. Some things are not novels. Plays are not novels. Epic poems are not novels. Romances are not novels. And here's where it gets tricky. There is a genre we call prose romance. The knights, the daring do, heroes rescuing ladies and having a kind of a personal growth, character forming adventures. If there's a difference between the epic and the romance, and there is, one of those differences is the epic is about a national hero on whom the fate of an entire people depend. A romance is about an elite hero who is a private elite hero, who is undergoing his or sometimes her own particular quest and journey. So Britomart is mostly a romance figure, as most of the knights are. She edges towards romance, towards epic, because she's going to be the ancestress of the British people, etc. Adam and Eve belong to the epic, Milton's epic. They are about on their fate. On their fate depends the fate of all of their descendants, which is everybody. The novel moves to chronicle private life details, the details of the everyday life, the mundane, including the not extraordinary. This is different. You can have a novel about a servant. In fact, some of the great early novels are about servants. Writing letters home, God, my master is trying to sleep with me and he's cute, but I really don't I'm not that kind of girl. Okay, an everyday problem with characters who are not larger than life, but life-sized. In this period of history, Europe becomes interested in its own daily experience as a subject of art. We're moving towards the very beginning of the 19th century. We have novels like Jane Austen, which is about, okay, like, well, young ladies at the fringes of the upper class trying to get married, but they don't have good prospects. They let people come to dinner and are rude. This is the domain of the novel. Ben is one of the writers who's moving towards the novel. Oroonoko is a combination of novel and romance. How could that be? It combines larger-than-life elite characters who have extraordinary experiences, who are not like people you ordinarily meet, like people outside your normal experience, people who are, say, captive princes. And it has people who are very ordinary indeed, like the narrator, who is seemingly Afro-Ben. The rise of the novel is basically like, hey, let's just go back to Chaucer's Pilgrims and the everydayness of them, and let's just talk about in prose, about what they do all day long. This is a romance. The fact it's subtitled like The Captive Slave, right? Of the prince, the enslaved. It's about an enslaved prince. One of the things romance does is it's not interested in the middle at all. You're a prince or a slave, or you're a prince and a slave. You're extremely poor and you eat rocks. You're a penniless shepherd, or you're a glamorous prince. And there's no in-between. The novel is about the in-between. It is famously a middle-class genre about shopkeepers. Most of the people whom Britain sent to the colonies there are a few aristocrats, but mostly people who are of the middling sort. Here's a distinction between a romance character and a novel character. And these characters exist in the same text. If you have a character and his name is Aragorn, but some of his friends call him Alessar, and he's the heir of long lost kings, and he's been wandering the wilderness with his broken sword left behind him from his ancestors who defeated the Dark Lord at the period of whatever, and he's betrothed, not engaged, but betrothed to an elf princess who's immortal, but first he has to do that is romance, my friend. That is romance. That's not about everyday life. That's romance. Aragorn has a friend. His name is Sam. Sam has a job as a gardener. He digs in a garden. Sam likes to drink beer and eat potatoes. Sam is from a novel. How do we know? For starters, his name is Sam. Regular guy. Character from a novel. Aragorn, the king in disguise who's going to return. Romance. What's the distribution here? Oroonoko, aka Caesar, is, especially when we call him Oroonoko in Africa, is living in the world of romance. The Suriname sections of this book are heavily novelistic, so realistic they pose as nonfiction. And there are non-fictional characters in them. There's Ben, the governor, the lieutenant governor. Some of these figures and your footnotes scrupulously tell you, your endnotes scrupulously tell you, oh yes, this is an actual person. Suriname's a real place. Ben was probably really there. Don't take this as straightforward. This is not nonfiction. She is a fiction writer. Even the Suriname passages are heavily fictionalized, but it's a novelistic fiction that is about ordinary people doing more or less ordinary things. Yes, a little unusual in that they're colonists in a place that seems to them exotic, but regular people doing regular things. They're not larger than life. In fact, Ben goes to great pains because she criticizes her fellow colonists to show how much they are not larger than life. Actually, a little smaller than life, a little diminutive. The Africa sections, the section Commentien, are straight romance. Let me read you from page 13. The king of Commentien was himself a man of 100 and odd years old, and had no son, though he had had many beautiful black wives, for certainly there are beauties that can be that can charm of that color. In his younger years he had many gallant men to his sons, 13 of which died in battle, conquering when they fell, and he had only left him for his successor one grandchild, son to one of these dead victims, who as soon as he could bear a bow in his hand and a quiver on his back, was sent into the field to be trained up by one of the oldest generals to war, and so on this sentence goes. I would point out with all the semicolons, that sentence goes on for a long time. If you're thinking about form, we have no more poetic technique, we have no meter, but think about how Ben constructs her sentences, and especially think about imagery and figures of speech. But I want to start with, the king is a man of 100 and odd years old. Man in the 17th century, before modern medicine, perfectly sharp in his faculties, over 100 years old. Really now? No. No, that didn't happen. The average life expectancy was not over 100. Oh, holy cannoli, no. And the 13 sons, a kind of fairy tale number. And he's down to only one super heroic grandchild who's been trained at war since he could hold the weapons in his hand. This is all extreme. Romance goes to moments of extreme things. You're at great highs or great lows. Oroonoko is always at great highs and great lows. That is a fantasy. As your notes will tell you, the entire structure of kingship in the Commentien passages is a fantasy. It is a fantasy that does not distinguish between various non-Western peoples. Like this is imagined as a patriarchal kingship because the British have a patriarchal kingship, and the fact it's a matrilineal kingship is kind of too much for their heads to bear. They're not interested in that. They're not interested. Even Ben, who wants to build up Oroonoko, aka Caesar, as a heroic figure, who it is wrong to enslave. And certainly, he is heroic, and it is always wrong to enslave him. She is not interested in African's actual experience. She and her audience, and Europeans more generally in this time period, are interested in Africa as a place to inscribe their own fantasies and wish fulfillment narratives, as a place for fabulous storytelling. They use the rest of the non-European world in much the same way. The thing where the king sends a veil to a woman and then she has to come to the harem, that is very strange. That is ridiculous. That would cause if the king, generally speaking, monarchs cannot just, or even tribal leaders can't just like take other elite young women without compensation to their fathers. I mean, it is to their fathers, but like that, you have the veil and you've been sent the royal veil and you must go to the harem or the otan, which is not an African word. Your previous engagement to another fiancé notwithstanding, that is not realistic. That's a fantasy. That is Ben's fantasy that she's imposing onto a West African context. And the whole story about like Oroonoko pining for love and fighting wars and being separated from his beloved who's in his grandfather's harem. This is all just playtime for Ben's European imagination. You should take none of it seriously. She claims to have been told all this story by Caesar. You should take that with a large shipment of salt as well. The Suriname passages and the Middle Passage the Middle Passage is the trek across the Atlantic in the ships of the transatlantic slave trade. You should take that relatively seriously, or I would say, when you see things that seem like extreme descriptions of the treatment of slaves, you should take them seriously. If you are tempted to view Oroonoko / Caesar's final execution is too grisly to be realistic, I am very sorry to tell you that is part of the novelistic part of this proto-novel, this pre-novel. That is in the realistic section. If you are inclined to doubt that Oroonoko might go on hunger strike on the slave ship and perhaps starve himself to death, this was in fact a routine behavior of captured Africans. They did not all make it to the Western Hemisphere. Sometimes because some people would get depressed, refuse to eat, and just lie down and die. Others would get sick because the conditions in the slave ships were foul and inhumane. If you think the descriptions of slavery seem over the top, I'm afraid to tell you they are not. As a rule of thumb, if something in Oroonoko seems, if you're wondering if something in Oroonoko is plausible or realistic or not, if it makes you uncomfortable, it's probably on the level. If you don't like hearing about it and it gives you a squicky feeling, yeah, that's probably on the level. If it's super cool and romantic and magical, and oh my God, yeah, that's romance, my man. That's a fairy tale right there. Both of these things are in play and they're talking and they're in conversation with each other. Oroonoko is a figure from romance. He's imagined romantically, who is then not treated with proper respect in the novelistic side of things. Part of the critique of his enslavement is that someone like him should not be enslaved, but also that this doesn't allow him to be the romantic, charismatic, larger-than-life figure he should be, while the extremely petty Europeans who are greedy, who are selfish, who are lazy, who are cowardly, are bringing him down to their level.